Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at Fröhlich soll mein Herz springen, which translates to Merrily my heart shall leap. This is a pretty interesting chorale, very unusual form with these sort of conjoined short phrases. Also just harmonically a little bit all over the place, a little very, very active in proportion to the length and the amount of content in the chorale, with short phrases dominating the texture and modulations occurring between them. It makes analyzing modulation somewhat difficult, blurring the line between what's a common chord modulation and what is a direct modulation. But in this case, I do think these are all common chord modulations just because of the frequency in which the phrases occur. Bach just sort of pins us from an analytical standpoint into a situation where we have to analyze a modulation on short notice. But we're just going to hop right into the analysis. We start on G major, we end on G major, and there's one sharp in the key signature. So I reckon we're in the key of G major, but our first cadence is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of C major. Our second chord is C, C, E, and G, which is our 4 chord, C major. And then we have this syncopated bass, C, F sharp, D, and A, which is D7 over F sharp. That's 5-4-2. And we would expect that to go to 1-6, which it does, B, G, D, and G. And I do believe this is where we go to the key of C major, or at least this is the first opportunity that Bach presents for us to modulate, because we get this really interesting A flat here. And I think by that point we've already started to enter the realm of C, not necessarily C major, but some mode mixture going on and implying C. So after our 5-6 chord, we get A, C, E, and A, a bit of a deceptive progression. That's A minor with a passing tone in the melody. Then we get A flat, C, F, and C. On the surface, this looks like 4-6, which is totally fine. We do see 4 being borrowed in mode mixture contexts and tonal music. That's fine. But the way that this C looks, I reckon this C is actually an accented non-chord tone, and what we're actually looking at is, well, actually the C is a chord tone, but I think this D also plays a role in the grand scheme of the chord, and we're actually dealing with D, F, A flat, and C, which would be a 2-4-3 chord, D minor 7 flat 5 over A flat. 6 wants to go to 2, and when we see chromaticism in the bass, when we see like a series of linked half steps, like we do see here, chord progressions tend to get a little wonky, especially when they're descending like this. So the fact that Bach is able to link 6 to 2 via borrowing chords from the parallel minor is pretty neat. So I think this D actually is a chord tone here, and this C coincidentally is also a chord tone because it happens to be the 7th of the chord as well. But whether you analyze this as 4-6 or 2-4-3, I think they're both accurate analyses and get the point across. But our next chord is G, E, G, and C, which is C major over G. That's 1-6-4. This D right here is where we resolve to. Sorry, I was looking at it as if it were a passing tone, but no, or a neighbor tone rather. G, D, G, and B. That's our good old 5 chord G major. Put a bracket underneath it for habit's sake. And then we cadence on C major, C, E, G, and C. Tonic triad, root position. Now we get our first series of adjacent short phrases, and I do believe that this C is our gateway into the key of A minor. You can make the argument that the gateway is a chord afterwards as well. This is a modulation zone where when you're dealing with keys that have not necessarily identical but similar pitch collections, they have more chords in common than they don't. It could be difficult to analyze in some cases where the modulation happens, especially if it's over a series of chords that is diatonic to both sets of pitches. But in this case, I'm just going to mark C as the modulation point. G could also be the modulation point, but I think it happens before the G sharp. So G, G, B, and D, that is a 7 chord. A little bit of transitive harmony here. We would expect 7 to go to 3, not the other way around, but Bach does this all the time. Passing 7th in the tenor, neighbor tone in the alto. Then we get G sharp, E, B, and E, which is E major over G sharp, that's 5-6. Sometimes we do see our subtonic 7th going to 5, but because the subtonic 7th is relatively uncommon, it gets some use, but it's definitely less common than our diminished 7th or the diminished 7th counterpart. Because it's a stable chord, we do often see it used as a predominant, or sometimes see it used as a predominant. But after our 5 chord, we do go to our 1 chord A minor, A, E, A, and C, tonic triad, making this an imperfect authentic cadence of sorts. Looking ahead, we move back to the key of G major, and we end the short phrase in a half cadence in the key of G major. I do think there is some symmetry between these phrases, at least in the way that I'm going to analyze them, and this A minor is now 2 in the key of G major. We then have some transitive harmony, again, 2 going to 6, E, E, G, and B, which is E minor in root position. I suppose this C could also be a chord tone, and this could be, instead of E minor, it could be C major over E, but that's really splitting hairs because the chords are more or less identical. They share more tones in common than they don't, and they're both functioning in the same way. I don't really see it super pertinent to split hairs, but I hear this as a minor chord, and I also see the fact that there's transitive harmony going on between the two entries. We have 3 going to 7, and here we have 2 going to 6, so I feel like there's some symmetry going on here. But after our 6th chord, we go to B, D, G, and D, tonic triad in first inversion, G major over B, passing tone in the bass, and then we get D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our dominant triad root position, half cadence. And then we finish our next phrase with a perfect authentic cadence in the key of G major. We start the phrase with another D major chord, D, A, F sharp, and D, and then we get G major, G, B, G, and D. It's our tonic triad with the passing 7th in the bass, and then we get E, C, G, and C, which is C major over E. It's a 4-6 chord. And then we get B, D, G, and D, 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 G, and B. That's G major in second inversion. This A is an anticipation. Then we get an interesting interruption of the 1-6-4 going to 5. And typically when we see this interruption, it's via this lower neighbor tone. That's been pretty consistent when Bach does interrupt the flow from 1-6-4 to 5. And it's typically with a 2-6-5 chord, C, E, G, and A, which it's like in this case. And then we get D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 5 chord, with the passing 7th and the tenor. And what I've been doing to analyze these interrupted 1-6-4-5 progressions is using a dashed bracket, because the resolution happens, it's just interrupted by another chord, which is kind of interesting. And then we cadence on G major, of course, G, B, D, and G, which is our tonic triad in root position. Alright, so starting off what I guess I'm calling the B section, we're going to stay in the key of G major, and I do apologize for the eraser marks. I recorded a take of this particular phrase, and I thought I went off on the wrong track, but it turns out that I was actually right in the first place, so I'm going to go back and redo this. So I already have written here that this is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor. However, this has serious deceptive cadence vibes in terms of how it ultimately just sneaks up on us, but I think ultimately it is a imperfect authentic cadence, but there is an argument to be made that it is a deceptive cadence as well. So starting things off in the key of G, we start off with C major, C, C, E, and G, that's our 4 chord, passing tone in the bass, and then we get E, G, B, and G, and where this could be an E minor chord, I think this B is an accented non-chord tone, and it's actually C sharp, E, and G here, which is a secondary dominant, 7-6 of 5, because C sharp's the leading tone to D, and D is our dominant. We then have D, F sharp, D, and A, which is our 5 chord. Passing tones here, passing 7th in the alto, passing tone in the bass, before we get F natural, G, B, and G. This is a really interesting chord, very similar to the chord that we had in yesterday's chorale, I believe, or the day before yesterday. Ultimately, Bach skips the resolution to the tonic and instead adds that 7th there to start sort of spinning off into a different key, or just keep the momentum of tonicizing something other than the tonic. So here we have G7 over F which I do think is functioning as a secondary dominant. This is 5/4-2 of 4, and we would expect that to resolve there, and for all intents and purposes it does. We have E, G, and C in the lower voices, but we have A here as well, making this A minor 7 over E. That's a 2/4-3 chord, and in terms of C major, this is a deceptive progression, 5/4-2 going to 6/4-3, and coincidentally, I do think this is where we go to C major. This is now a 6/4-3 chord, and we are going to be using C major as a vessel to get to the key of A minor. So we have D here as a neighbor tone, F as a neighbor tone, D as a neighbor tone, and this B is a passing tone. Sorry, I forgot to erase that from my previous take. This is B diminished over D. This is a 7/6 chord in the key of C major. 6 going to 7 is a fairly normal progression in Bach, like predominant and dominant functioning chord, and that's where we resolve to C major, C, G, C, E, G, C, and C, which is our tonic triad and first inversion. And then interestingly enough, another tone that made it from my previous take, apologies, that's a neighbor tone. We have passing tones in the alto and the bass as well. This is a D7 chord over F sharp, which is somewhat interesting because it doesn't resolve where we would expect it to, and I think this ultimately contributes to the deceptive progression argument. This chord, functionally speaking, is 5/6-5 of 5, and we would expect this to go to a 5 chord, but instead Bach prolongs the resolution to 1/6-4. That's totally fine, because eventually the 1/6-4 chord should go to 5, and that would it would basically fulfill the promise that this chord is making, that it is going to resolve where it does. But for all intents and purposes, the chord's bass resolves the way we expect it to, and because 5 and 1 share that tone in common, that's what I think makes this resolution possible. So this is a 1/6-4 chord, C major over G, 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 E, and C. But here's where the deceptive nature of the cadence comes in, and the more that I talk about it, the more that I feel this actually is a deceptive cadence. And I might even walk back what I said earlier about this being imperfect authentic, because this E is really functioning in a deceptive fashion as well. But I think whether you mark this as a deceptive cadence or if you view this as an imperfect authentic cadence, this is one of those ambiguous cadences that just doesn't quite have a singular identity, in my opinion. And even if you feel strongly about it being one particular cadence over the other, there's undeniable evidence about it being one or the other. We have a 5/1 progression in A minor, but the resolution that or a chord that foreshadows the fact there is going to be a dominant never gets fulfilled. So there's qualities of both here. So after this we have G sharp, E, D, and B, which is E7 over G sharp, and I'm going to call that 5/6-5 of 6 now, and then we're going to end on 6, A, E, C, and C. That's just what it feels like to me. Like I said, you could analyze this in the key of A minor as like 3/6-4, 5/6-5 going to 1, or you could even analyze as early as this D major chord here, because that would be a harmonization of the melodic minor scale. But the reason why I'm hesitant to do that is because if this were a harmonization of melodic minor, we wouldn't see the chromatic movement here in the bass. We would just see F sharp going to G sharp. We do see chromatic movement in the bass in Bach from time to time, and honestly, it just creates wacky chord progressions, the same way that we saw it here. We see unusual chords when Bach writes with chromaticism in the bass. In a more tamer case, we have it here where we have 7 going to 5. 7 or subtonic 7 is not the most common predominant chord, but here we do see Bach using it in the context to fit that narrative or fit that idea of the ascending bass line chromatically. So I'm going to actually side with the fact that this is deceptive now based on the context that is present and that we have available to us. But I think ultimately speaking, depending on how you view the harmony, again, you can mark it either way. This is definitely a multifaceted cadence that has a dynamic identity. So looking ahead, we're going to stay in the idea of A minor. I am going to call this 6 chord now 1 in the key of A minor. It's kind of interesting how in a roundabout fashion it ends up just winding up being just one in the key of A minor anyways, but there's no doubt in my mind that this sounds like a deceptive progression to me. Or it could be following the short form of this idea that the cadences are, the phrases are short beforehand. But maybe I'm overthinking it. I don't know. To me, this sounds like a deceptive cadence, but I felt pressured to call it an imperfect authentic cadence because it was being preceded by its own dominant. But here, I do really feel like this is a deceptive cadence, but I'll leave it ambiguous in my notes. But that being said, we start things off with B, D, F sharp, and D, and we have sort of an allusion here to A melodic minor, but the G sharp doesn't resolve to A, it goes down to E, and that's something that we could expect. It is in one of the inner voices, but ultimately what happens is this B chord is just, melodic minor, so instead of B being diminished, this is B being minor, and that is borrowing from the relative major, not relative major, the parallel major, or a harmonization of melodic minor. They both basically say the same thing. This C is a passing tone, and then we get E, B, G sharp, and E. That is our 5 chord in root position. And then we have another imperfect, another imperfect authentic cadence, even though this feels like deceptive to me. This is an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of A minor. There's no no real room to argue here. There's no real room for an argument. Looking ahead for the next phrase, we follow the same form that we had in the A section, where we have a half cadence in the key of G major. I'm still going to call this A minor chord our 2 chord and our gateway to the key of G major. And then we get E, G, G, and B, again very similar to the phrase that we have here, 2 going to 6, more transitive harmony. This A is a passing tone, the C is a passing tone. Kind of gives us a vibe of a passing 2-4-3 chord, and you know what, because 6 typically wants to go to 2, I will mark it as such. And we also saw another 2-4-3 chord earlier, and maybe that's significant, or it's coincidental, I don't know. But we have 2-4-3 going to an unlikely destination, D, B, F sharp, and D, which is B minor over D, which is a 3-6 chord. 2 can go to 3. I mean, any chord ultimately can go anywhere. This is an example of adjacent harmony, and 3 is kind of being substituted for 5 here, because 5 would have D and F sharp as well, but the difference between the 2 chords is A versus B, and in this case 3 is sort of prolonging the resolution, and because 5 is on the horizon, perhaps it makes more sense that 3 is referenced here from a narrative standpoint, because introducing 5 before the cadence might diminish the effect that the cadence has, because 5 is the landing point. But afterwards we get a chord that makes sense after 3. We have E, G, G, and B, making this this is E minor in root position. That is a 6 chord. 3 wants to go to 6, so that's a good sign. And then we cadence on 5 in first inversion, F sharp, D, A, and A. And let me double check and see if this actually is in first inversion. It is. We are cadencing on a 5-6 chord. It's always interesting to see cadences that have inversions. I made a mistake one time and actually printed my copy wrong, where I thought we ended on an inverted triad, but that wasn't necessarily the case. It was just a misprint or a miscopying of my MIDI file that I use to produce scores like this. But yeah, inverted cadences happen every once in a while. Half cadences, imperfect authentic cadences, typically not with perfect authentic cadences though, maybe once or twice, but it doesn't really register in my brain right now that any of them have occurred recently, if anything. But looking ahead, we're going to stay in the key of G major. Working our way towards the end of the chorale is fairly straightforward. We go from 5-6 to 1, G, B, G, and D. It's G major. Passing tones in the lower voices before we get B, D, G, and D. I guess you could look at this G as sort of like a 6-5 suspension over the bass and make the argument that this is going to a 3 chord, but I just look at this as 1-6, and this F sharp is a neighbor tone. Sometimes Bach tricks us and implies that the note that actually looks like it's being suspended is actually part of the chord, and that's totally fine. because we have the context to separate the fact that this is probably a 1/6 chord. Typically 1 going to 3 is relatively unusual. The fact that there's counterpoint going on here and blurring the lines makes me feel like 1/6 is more likely of a chord to be going on here. Afterwards we get B, E, G, and C. This is pretty interesting. This is C major 7 over B. That's a 4/4/2. And it goes exactly where we would expect it to go. We have A, we have F sharp, we have A, and we have C. This is F sharp diminished over A, which is 7/6. It's pretty cool. After our 7/6 chord, it goes to 1 like we would expect. B, G, D, and B. 1/6 more specifically. This C is a passing tone, this E is a passing tone, and this A is an anticipation. And this actually spells out the precadential chord or predominant chord that we typically expect in perfect authentic cadences, 2/6/5, C, G, E, and A minor 7 over C. And then we get a long dominant idea over 2 beats before we inevitably cadence on G major in a perfect authentic cadence. D, D, F sharp, and A is our 5 chord. Bach loves 2/6/5 chords, and they typically go to 5. This C is a decorative 7th. This B is a non-chord tone. This G turns into a 4/3 suspension over the bass. It turns into a non-chord tone as well. D, C, F sharp, and A, because the G, like I just mentioned, is a 4/3 suspension, making this a 5/7 chord. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral like I just did right there. We can just write 7 here because the chord is turning into a 7 chord, and we can just reflect that in the figured bass before we cadence on G major, G, B, D, and G, tonic triad, root position. And I want to apologize for the all the eraser markings here. I had gotten in my own head about my analysis because my notes were kind of unclear, but here it's actually, we do have a modulation to the key of C major, and this 5/6/5 of 5 chord is just an interesting chord that has its resolution ultimately delayed, or ultimately excluded, but delayed by the 1/6/4 chord. It's very interesting. So whether this is a deceptive cadence or an imperfect authentic cadence, I think that's anyone's guess, but as far as what I hear, I definitely hear a deceptive effect, and that makes me feel like a deceptive cadence is afoot. But there's tons of really interesting stuff going on here. Secondary deceptive progressions, interesting modulations over common chords, interrupted 1/6/4/5 progressions as well, and that's pretty much it. Relatively straightforward, definitely like middle to like middle high level of difficulty. Yeah, and some interesting chromaticism as well, actually. Lots of chromatic movement in the bass, which typically means interesting chord progressions. But on that note, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon if you are interested in getting a daily notification about my upload schedule. But other than that, I'm gonna end the video on that note. Again, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.